What we had to do was make sure that subconsciously the consumer was absorbing all of the elements of what made Route 66 an icon. In the same way, what makes Levi's an icon. You don't have to look at the Levi's tag and you understand that it's Levi's. You understand what it means. You only have to look at, if you like, Philip Morris decal. In fact, in many parts of the world, that's all it's able to use, and yet people recognize it. But you only have to look at Coca-Cola to see the script, to recognize it's quintessentially American. We had to recreate that in Route 66. A lot of people just say, well, all you have to do is put the Route 66 symbol on the product. Well, no, when we launched the brand, 2000 to 2015, we really created the franchise for Route 66 products. So we ended up net revenue of around 200 million a year. It could have been more, when you think that you've created a product that has a value between half to three-quarters of a billion, and you've literally done it yourself. We're very conscious of the fact that we had to get this right. Far too many products, as you know, are corporate. They come out of some corporate grinder. They're down to the lowest common denominator. And they think that this is going to appeal to everybody. And of course, you don't want anything that appeals to everybody. You want something that appeals to a certain community that is going to bring it up, that other people want to be part of. If you make it appeal to everybody, nobody is going to want it. And that's still something that large corporations haven't understood.
Welcome to the Haggai podcast. Buckle up. This episode is brought to you by Cards Biz, a business card too good to give away. This episode is brought to you by Better Weight for Life, transformational weight loss aid, led by U.S. board-certified physicians, providing access to GLP-1 medications like Wegovy and Zepbound that are proven to help you lose weight and keep it off.
Hello, André.
Haggai, it's always a pleasure.
It's a delight. It really is a delight. Really, really. It's like, it's like I've known you now for a bit, and I have to say, every time I think both of us walk, we enter the call smiling and we walk away smiling. I don't know what happens during the call, but it's always a delight. Yeah, I think you're more than going to earn it. So on that note, André, who are you really? Like, tell the world, who is André?
Well, it's an interesting question. André is somebody who loves a challenge, who never grew out of asking why or why not, and who probably managed to piss off more people in the companies he worked for by asking why or why not, or what if we did it this way instead? And I don't think I've lost that. I think it's what drives me still, probably not as much as it did before, but it still drives me. And that's, I think it's partly because of my upbringing as well, my circumstances. As you probably know, but others don't, perhaps. I don't know if it's relevant. But when we were expelled from Egypt in 56, we came to a different country, a foreign country. We came to the UK. To a very great extent, we were outsiders looking in. And as a child at that age, you ask yourself, why? Why do people behave this way? Why do people do this? Why do people do that? But I always had my nose stuck in a book, and I still have my nose stuck in a book. So I was always trying to learn about things.
It's interesting because...
So I'm just a curious individual. That's
you are.
Really basically what it is.
You are. I can attest to that from knowing you.
Thank you for that.
But it's interesting. You mentioned childhood and a theme. I mean, in this podcast, we talk a lot about the entrepreneurial experience, right? Both from the emotional state, the personal, the business aspects, of it. And I'm very curious. It's like, did you see the beginning of your entrepreneurial instincts as a kid already? Like, were you born? Were you made an entrepreneur?
My father died when we were 13. So, at that age, suddenly you've lost the anchor that you had, and you essentially have to make your own way. And it's not an untypical story of entrepreneurs. They lose the main parent or the father figure at a very early age. And they tend to find the resources within themselves rather than relying on anybody else. So I think it is partly curiosity, which every entrepreneur has to have. An entrepreneur succeeds really or creates something because they've asked the fundamental question, why or what if? But behind that, there are other influences that influence their decision to become an entrepreneur. In my case, being made redundant twice and being fired once probably helped the process.
So why don't you kind of share a bit, like, what were you fired from? And how did you get to the point before you got fired?
I was fired from actually a job that I was pretty very successful in, but it was a change from one of the large companies that I was employed by. It was a smaller company. It was an advertising agency. And it was responsible for most of the advertising in airports around the world. It almost had a monopoly on that. And my job was in part to sell to the existing customers and in part to actually maximize the revenue at the same time for the airports. So for the airports, advertising revenue at the time wasn't necessarily seen as to form a critical revenue stream that it does now. So we were rather ahead of the time. There was a major client. The biggest client was BAT, British American Tobacco, which operated, as you can imagine, every country in the world practically duty-free. And the brand manager for the airport advertising used to work in this particular company, which I won't mention for a moment, but used to work in this particular company in the same role and then was headhunted when the existing brand manager was made brand manager of Benson of Hedges. So he became the liaison between the brands internally and the external agency, which was us. He wasn't treated very well by the previous incumbent. And it wasn't untypical in those days for people to view advertising agencies as being almost slaves or servants to their requirements. It wasn't my way of working at all. He got very upset when I used to leave his luggage outside on the street in the hotel and carry my own. And, he would complain that he used to have to do that. And I used to say, well, it's your fault. That's not what you're paying me for. And unfortunately, he was also an alcoholic, which made life very difficult when we went away on trips. And ultimately culminated in a 6-week trip around Central and South America. He lost his passport and travelers checks. I managed to get him a new passport, new travelers checks. He left home early because he was missing his wife. I continued on the entire journey, booking all the space. On my own. It wasn't an enjoyable experience at all for six weeks traveling around. When I got back and I was speaking to him, he rang me up and he said, I've decided to go direct.
Mm-hmm.
So I got really very annoyed and I called him a 4-letter word, beginning with C and ending in T. And he complained to the managing director, with whom I already wasn't very popular. And it's a sort of organization where, for instance, I tripled the turnover, but I also doubled the telephone bill.
Mm-hmm.
In my view, you couldn't do one without the other, but then I was castigated for increasing the telephone bill. Anyway, long story short, I was fired. For a short while, I worked for myself. I actually got a contract with CNA to develop a video called Learn to Ski. I'd never done anything like this, but thought, why not? I still can't remember how I got the contract, but they handled the negotiations, the script, and the filming. I handled the marketing, and I did it extraordinarily well. I was very pleasantly surprised, and I was really quite enjoying it.
Because
in the context,
because you were your own boss, because of the subject matter. Like, what made you enjoy it so much?
well, actually, in part because I was my own boss, I could make my own decisions, and in part because it was something completely new that I succeeded in. It never occurred to me that I couldn't do it. So I just sort of put the pieces together and decided, well, okay, this is what needs to be done. Let's get out and do it. And it worked. It worked extremely well. So it's a CNA Learn to Ski video that was made at the time. And that was really my first one. Then I was offered a job. First time I was offered a job with this particular company, with Rothmans. They wanted me to change my name because they were very big in the Middle East, and I refused. I walked out of the interview. And the second time, I actually interfaced with the one of the directors there because they were bought far too many blank videos rather, and I bought them at a very cheap price, very low price, and we got on very well. And he suggested that I should go to an interview, and I told him what happened. He said, "Don't worry about that." So that's in the past now, and I went then, and I started working for yet another large corporation, but in a very entrepreneurial role.
What does that mean?
Well, it meant that I was handling an area which historically hadn't generated very much revenue. So it was East and Central Africa. The vast majority of Rothman's business in Africa was in Western Africa, as it was for likes of Philip Morris, et cetera, et cetera. East and Central Africa was historically, however, the bedrock of Rothman's original activities. They had a factory there and had a large organization, the first market, really African market outside of South Africa. They relied on their partners, and unfortunately their partners who were supermarket owners behaved as though the product was a supermarket product.
Yeah.
So they suddenly started discounting the price and doing price offers. And that upset the community because tobacco in that part of the world is a very valuable commodity. You buy it one stick at a time because that's what you can afford. There was this sense that you were cheating on them, that you charged them too much. And so the whole thing collapsed and they did a deal with BAT and they walked away. They agreed they wouldn't go back into the market for 20 years. Well, 20 years came to an end and along came I. And I thought, well, this is a great opportunity. How do we get product in? We couldn't get, with difficulty, we could get import licenses because you needed hard currency. But then I found out that we also sponsored the East African Safari Rally, large part of which took place in Kenya. So I agreed that we could swap the budget, in other words, the financial spend, for product. And for the first time in about 20 years, we imported product into Eastern Central Africa. And the agreement terminated between BAT and Rothmans at about the same time. And so there was an opportunity to create a much bigger business unit to reinstate what actually had left. And really it was a consequence of my getting product in, finding a way of getting product in, and the end of the sort of purdah, if you like, that came to an end. And it gave me the opportunity of becoming my own boss when I was made regional manager or area manager of Central and Eastern Africa, and opened up a new office in Nairobi. And I was left very much to my own devices, and I enjoyed it immediately, intensely. I really did. As my own boss, I had certain objectives. It took me 6 months to achieve 18 months objectives. I got a permission from the government to open up a factory in Kenya, which they didn't think was even possible. And I forgot one salient lesson: you never show your boss up. So, you can have an entrepreneurial spirit within large corporations as long as you bring your boss along with you.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think I did enough of that. It wasn't a question of having humility. It was just a question of this was the objective. This is what I wanted to achieve. And this is what I'd been asked to achieve. So I did. But that clearly didn't please people internally in the company. In fact, when I was ultimately made redundant, my director gave me my immediate director gave me a rather backhanded compliment by saying, the last thing I need is a super director by my side. But he still made me redundant, just got married, taken on a mortgage, and I had no income. Thank you very much.
Most Western entrepreneurs don't have an experience working in Africa, don't have an experience working in Africa at all. And so in what way is that different than people, selling in Europe, the US, even Asia? And like how much, again, there's an assumption in what I'm saying that like human trust, human connections, personal relationships, trust make a big part of it. But am I right?
Yes.
Okay.
Far more so than in Europe. Asia and Africa, in many respects, in terms of trust and relationships, are very, very similar. You cannot do business in that part of the world unless they trust you.
Mm-hmm.
They trust that you will do what you say you do, and likewise, you show respect. And I think one of the biggest learnings that I had from Africa was I'd always been brought up by my father to treat people in exactly the way that I expected to be treated. So I showed, because it was inbuilt in me, we showed people the same respect that we expected to get. It didn't matter that the person that I was speaking to was an employee. It didn't matter that it was the prime minister. We showed respect, and we expected to get respect back. And if you don't get respect back, then there's a problem along the way. But it was really embedded in Africa. And the other thing that I learned is that it's very easy to make assumptions about cultures, to make assumptions about people if you don't understand them. And one of the biggest irritations I had was in my interactions, actually not with the Africans, but actually with the expats who used to think that the Africans were stupid. And one of the examples you used to give is you say, is somebody not there? Is somebody not in the office? And they would go mad when the answer would be yes. That's because they didn't understand the structure of the African language. And I made a point of trying to learn the African language. And, it was like a light bulb moment going on, because the Africans are very literal. So when you ask, is somebody not there? They will answer quite honestly, yes, he is not there. But in English, we would say, no, he is not there. But to the African, that's not true.
Mm-hmm.
The answer is yes, he is not there, which of course is a fundamentally different way of saying the same thing.
Yeah.
So it gave rise to all sorts of misinterpretations. And, if you don't understand the culture, you're not going to get very far. If you don't respect the people, whoever they are, you're not going to get very far. And that really applies, I think, in all countries, doesn't it? But particularly so there. And it was an opportunity to see that really working out. Our life in the UK had been very different because we came from different backgrounds. So, the question of respect was often one that actually was predicated more on the sense of superiority of who they were rather than, the respect for who we are. But in Africa, it really was brought down to this absolutely basic level, and the same thing in Asia as well. Do you show them respect? Do you respect them? And it's the same in the Middle East. And do you expect respect back? Because if you don't expect respect and you don't receive it and you allow them to show you disrespect, that shows weakness. And that is absolutely fatal in any relationship you will have out there. So yeah, our experience in Africa, I think really, really brought home how important trust is and how important understanding the culture was, and how, if necessary, understanding even how the language is formed, what idiosyncrasies there are in their language that would make them translate something in a different way, which would lead to misunderstanding.
So I hear a lot as you're talking about coming with respect, even being a bit humble as somebody from coming outside to a different culture. And something that I heard you say many times before about treating other people how you would like to be treated in some way. But what about the mechanics of a business? Like, how was it to do business in Africa? Like, any particular stories you can highlight? You're smiling. You're already laughing. I can see you're laughing.
I'm laughing because East and Central Africa was a very difficult place to do business in. And a large part of it revolved around your ability to pay large sums of money to people in order to do things. But I did manage to negotiate my way around, or navigate my way around some of those by appealing also to their pride. For instance, I was told it would take me at least a year to get a telex installed in my office. And I thought, I can't survive a year trying to communicate with my office. So I went to see the head of the post office there, knocked on his door, introduced myself. And I said to him, look, I really don't want to have to go to the president and tell him that I'm going to have to move my operation from Kenya to Zaire, because in Zaire I can get a telex, but I can't get one in Nairobi. And he said, and I said, I also can't get a P.O. box, I'm told, for another year either. So, it's impossible for me to communicate. And I'm going to just have to tell the president that it's just not going to work. And within 5 minutes, he'd called in the responsible person, who looked at him and said, this is absolutely the last telex line we have available and the last P.O. box we had available. And I walked out of the office with an appointment for the telex to be installed the next day and a P.O. box. You didn't always have to pay. You just had to understand what the pain points were. So, I had many instances like that, but in many instances I also had to pay, and that was the reality of it, without doubt. Nigeria being probably one of the worst. Well, again, it's a fundamental lack of understanding. Nigerian policemen, Nigerian officers, they're paid very, very little indeed. And in fact, the government relies on the fact that they will charge for their services. So when you arrive in Lagos, you used to have a $5 bill in your passport as you handed it across. Otherwise, you just wouldn't get in. They'd find a reason why you couldn't get in. And that also was an additional social responsibility, because whoever had a job was ultimately responsible for the extended family. So it wasn't just one person, for instance, who had a job and that was his salary. That's not how it worked. His salary was shared out by as many people as it could possibly go. So it was all part and parcel of the culture that if you wanted something, you would pay for it. Once you understood that, you weren't stupid, just didn't pay over the top. And you always haggled, always argued and haggled and said you couldn't afford to pay any more. And this was the last $5 note you had. And they wouldn't believe it, coming from a Mzungu or a white person, that they didn't have any more money, often brought looks of astonishment. You just had to make them believe you. So it was a very different environment working out there. You really had to think on your feet. You didn't have, like I said, you had the corporate name behind you, but the corporate name was way over in Aylesbury in the UK. It wasn't in Nairobi or Lagos, where I happened to be, where I shouldn't have been, because Rothmans was banned from Nigeria. It just so happens that my Ethiopian Airlines plane had to land there, and I just had to try and hide any business cards that mentioned Rothmans. Otherwise, I'd have spent some considerable time in a Nigerian prison.
Really?
Thank you.
I think that's like, those are things that people don't think about like doing day-to-day business, right? Especially not with major brands in them.
No, not at all. Not at all. And that's the part of the job that I really loved. Navigating the challenge of navigating. As I said, I love a challenge, and the challenge of navigating my way around there successfully was a major challenge. Bigger challenge was actually explaining it to the company internally.
Because totally different
There was this
experience.
well, there was a bigger language gap and cultural gap between the reality of what I was doing and what the other employees around the world were doing as well. Africa wasn't a comfortable place to go. It wasn't like you weren't going to travel to Japan and stay in a luxury 5-star hotel or the Middle East. You know, you weren't slumming it either. But once you got out of the capital, you definitely were slumming it.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't this sort of comfortable location. And, you know, you just had to work your way around it. And you had to make people believe you. If they didn't believe you, you were in deep trouble. And I suppose in that respect, a lot of that came back with me.
What do you mean by that? What came back from it?
Well, you know, the principle of treating people with my father instilled in me. So I used to see him interacting with workmen and senior officials in different environments. And it was always the same, courteous, respectful. And that was really quite challenging in the UK, actually, for me growing up. But it was sort of reinforced in my overseas visits. And it wasn't just Africa. You know, I traveled around Central and South America, traveled in the States, traveled in Asia, in India. So I've traveled a lot around the world. And I mean, there's some things that in Japan, I don't bother bowing anymore. I haven't been to Japan for a few years. But I quickly worked out it didn't matter how you bowed. You were always going to get it wrong. So rather than put myself in that position, I would put up my hand and shake the hand and actually turn the tables back on them.
Yeah.
It wasn't I was showing them disrespect because I was offering them my hand, but I wasn't going to put myself in the position of always being wrong from the minute you know you step into their environment. So it helped a lot. It matured me. It gave me a lot more confidence. The fact that I was able to do that gave me a lot more confidence in my ability to do something on my own, which of course essentially is what an entrepreneur is. You are on your own to begin with, as you know yourself.
Yeah. One word, in the end of the day, the buck stops here, right? In the end of the day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It did. And sometimes the overdraft stopped as well.
So I think that's actually a good segue to go back to that moment. I mean, that kind of catapulted you to being your own. So you got, you know, you were made redundant, fired, you just got married. So kind of what was going on? What was going on in your head as that was happening?
By the same token, it was paying me a salary. So at moments, I was already in two minds. Did I want to work for another company? Do I want to work for myself? Anyway, I was responsible for looking after my wife and any future family we might have. So I did try and find a job. At the same time, I actively explored different opportunities. As a consequence of the income that I was earning in Rothmans, I had a gold American Express card with a £10,000 overdraft. And I tried to see if there's something I could do with using that money as sort of, if you like, seed money. And in my travels around Africa, I found out that I used to bump into different executives from different corporations, particularly the drinks executives. There's just one executive handling all of the Middle East and Africa. There's just no way they could do it. So I started contacting them and saying, look, what if I leverage my contacts in East and Central Africa and Sudan and other areas? You know, would you be interested? And they said yes. I didn't have any money. I managed to negotiate exclusive agencies and actually with competing brands. So I was responsible for J&B while at the same time being responsible for Cutty Sark, historically competing brands. So I developed quite a big portfolio. My very first order came when I was in Kampala, staying at the Unspeakable Speak, which was at the time Uganda was in an interesting place. It was in the midst of just finished one civil war, and it was bedding down. And my wife rang me up and said, there's no money left. The overdraft is finished. And I remember saying to her, look, don't worry about it. I'll do a deal. And that night I met up with one of the contacts I've been speaking to for a while, and we shook on a deal. And I said, can you please transfer the funds to my bank account? Which he did. I immediately transferred the funds to the company. And then others started ordering, and I managed to negotiate transferable letters of credit, irrevocable transferable letters of credit, which ironically only the BCCI were really willing to do. And as you know, the BCCI was a bit of a scam.
So why don't...
But they weren't at the time.
Why don't you, I mean, not everybody understands this market and industry. So why don't you kind of explain what were you actually doing and how were you making money with these deals?
Well, I found importers that had the resources, first of all, to obtain the necessary permits. Because in all of those countries, you needed to get a permit to import. That meant you had to know the right people to pay off. That was their problem. These brands were major international brands, and they wanted them, and the companies wanted to sell into them. And so it was really finding the right person. But as a consequence of the travels that I had and the relationships that I built with people, a lot of the people that were in the tobacco business were also in the spirits business as well. So they had the confidence in me, they had the trust in me, they had the trust in my relationship, and vice versa. And I was able to develop a trusting relationship with my suppliers as well, which was very important. The ability to receive an irrevocable letter of credit, verbal letter of credit, meant the payment was guaranteed. I never had an issue with the letter of credit ever. Whereas when I was working with Rothmans, I don't think there was a single letter of credit that actually didn't have an issue attached to it. Yes, because it's all process driven, as you know, within the large corporations. So, if the process, the correct boxes are ticked, it causes pandemonium and havoc within the organization. But with this, you could adjust, you could adapt. And, I got enormous satisfaction of seeing a product that I had sold in the market because I knew that I had sold that. That was because of what I had done. And it gave me enormous satisfaction.
It sounds to this day. It sounds like to this day.
I hadn't realized it. For many years, I didn't actually realize the extent of the pleasure that it gave me to see the outcome of what it was that I was doing. But it's true. It does. It does. Enormous pride that you start with something. In this instance, a brand that was already created, that was already available. And I suppose gave me the confidence to create something for myself, which in the end, actually, we were forced to because we were running on your treadmill. Haggai was the one that I was running all the time because the more that I made these particular territories successful for the companies, the faster they wanted to take it back and, maintain and increase their margin and gain control over their markets. And that meant that I had to look for another product. And so it became a never-ending cycle, and I was getting very fed up with it. And that's when I had the idea, which actually a lot of importers have done over the last 15 years. As there's been so much consolidation in the market, a distributor for one brand would lose that, but he still has his pipeline. So they would create their own brands to put it down. I was just perhaps, if you like, 25 years ahead of the curve, and only because the corporations proved to be rather greedy and said, we don't want a middleman. We want to go directly to brand. No, it didn't matter the fact that you'd actually created the market or recreated the market for them. That didn't matter. So there was no loyalty on the part of the large corporations. And so it was becoming a necessity. We have to find our own brands. That's what we did.
So
it took us a while to do.
So how about we move to that? Your career started in corporate. It went to being an entrepreneur that opens markets for corporations. And then you moved into creating your own brands, your own products. How did that start?
Well, look, like a lot of entrepreneurs that you've spoken to, even like yourself, it starts by seeing a niche. It starts by seeing a gap that the large corporations in particular haven't seen. And in my case, it happened after a conversation with my immediate director, who a couple of weeks beforehand had explained to me how the company had rationalized a lot of their blends. So they only had about 2 main blends instead of the 20 different blends they had, each a different blend for each different brand, which essentially meant that a brand like Rothmans, for instance, at the time in Scotland was seen as a puffy brand, whereas Protégé was seen as a man's brand. Well, Protégé and Rothmans and Piccadilly was seen as a man's brand and Rothmans seen as a puffy southern brand. So Rothmans didn't sell north of that sort of line between southern and central England and the north. And Piccadilly didn't really sell that much below that line, but it was ended up by being the same blend. And 2 weeks or 3 weeks later, I said to him, why doesn't Rothmans create an American blend? Because American blend cigarettes like Marlboro, Lucky Strike, Pall Mall were really taking over we're making huge inroads into what would been traditionally Virginia tobaccos like Benson Hedges, Rothmans, Silk Cut, etc. And there was deep concern about this. And I was astonished by his response because he said to me, no, we've made the decision that Rothmans are going to continue doing what they're good at. And I said, what's that? He said, making Virginia cigarettes. And it was a sort of a light bulb moment because I suddenly realized that they didn't understand their own business because they thought that their business was producing Virginia cigarettes. I thought that their business, which is where this fundamental conflict, actually, I think, ultimately within my progress in the company as an individual and in the corporate structure, was that they were brand owners, but they happened to manufacture their products as well. But the key thing were the brands. For them, the key was the fact that they were manufacturers. The key wasn't the brands, even though they paid more than lip service to the brands. So you'd have this fundamental disconnect between what essentially I'd been told just 2 weeks before, where if you think about it, it meant that it was a brand that was dominant because the fact that the blend was the same as another brand, but they still wouldn't smoke that other brand because the associations weren't right. You know, it made me realize that there was a fundamental misunderstanding, lack of understanding, which I think was common in a lot of countries, certainly in the first company I worked for, Barrick Batteries, which was that was the first takeover by Hanson Industries. That was his first big purchase. It was very much that, you know, the brand was very secondary to the manufacturing process. So having understood that, I thought, well, I'm going to create a brand. I'm going to create a brand of American cigarettes because I know I can get manufacture. I know I can get an American blend. What isn't available is an American brand that is going to compete with the other American brands because those were sort of shared amongst the American brand manufacturers. BAT was the only one actually with Lucky Strike that had an American product because British American tobacco. And so I sat down with my wife and I explained the brief. This is extremely, my friend is it's really the creative director of the corporate, extremely creative individual. And I said that what we really need is something that is the brand name stands out on the shelf. The brand has to have all the associations that we can't afford to create. So it needs to exist already. It needs to be a universal symbol that it's quintessentially American. And this was not easy. And in fact, I had many sleepless nights because my braid used to wake me up in the middle of the night saying, I've got it. What is it? And she tells me another study and I go back to sleep. I'll try and go back to sleep. And so it was that set us off, that the knowledge, the belief actually, there was something out there. We knew that out there was the right brand. And it took us, I think, several months before sitting in the lounge. And Mairead went all quiet suddenly and she said, I've got it. And there was none of this usual, I've got it. There's no excitement in it. It was just a deep knowledge, really. It was sort of very calm, very centered. And she said, Route 66. And the minute she said Route 66, the picture suddenly, it's like a video, like a film, exploded in my mind. All of the associations that Route 66 had and still has sort of just came to mind. Just had to mention
Americana in 2 numbers.
Yes, yes, American popular culture, and it was as American as Coca-Cola, as American as Levi's, and in fact, those were the benchmarks that we took when we started developing the brand. We started looking at Coca-Cola, and we started looking at Levi's. We looked at Marlboro as well because of tobacco. We wanted to know what it was. It was about those brands that made them so successful. Really boiled down to the fact of their fundamental understanding that theirs was a brand. I mean, if you look at Coca-Cola as a classic example, it sends out a concentrate. It actually manufactures very little of its own product.
Yes. It manufactures the brand.
Exactly.
That's what it does. It manufactures the brand. And it even, and people who travel, we can tell you that Diet Coke, Coca-Cola, Coke Zero have different tastes in different regions of the world. It's not consistent. There's no Coca-Cola global taste. Yes.
It's brand values, imagery, associations, all of these create an impact. I mean, they've remained very, very true to the original Coca-Cola. There've been some developments along the way. I personally think a lot of the line extensions that they've got into recently are a mistake because they're moving away. I think some legacy brands are losing their way because the market has changed, but that to a certain extent, in my view, personal view, is overexposure anyway. Because the more you remove competition from the marketplace, the less choice you give. The less people are inclined to actually choose your product because they feel they're obliged to do so. So to a certain extent...
That's interesting. That's interesting. Can we spend a moment about this? So you say the lack of choice The fact that I don't actually have to choose again that I love you as a brand makes me love you less as a brand. Is that what you're saying?
And you can have the opposite when you have too much choice. Well, what do I choose?
Yeah.
But certainly, I do believe that the lack of choice that exists in a large number of major categories, and particularly in the drinks industry, because there's massive consolidation, is responsible for a large number of consumers turning away from the product. Because if that's all you can get, after a while, the experience is a repetitive one. And you want something different. Certainly I do. I want the ability, then I'm particularly difficult because I like to understand, I like to have a connection between what I'm buying and myself. Otherwise I just don't buy it. And that was the challenge that actually we had to create when we developed Route 66 cigarettes. What we had to do was make sure that subconsciously the consumer was absorbing all of the elements of what made Route 66 an icon. In the same way, what makes Levi's an icon. You don't have to look at the Levi's tag and you understand that it's Levi's. You understand what it means. You only have to look at, if you like, Philip Morris decal. In fact, in many parts of the world, that's all it's able to use, and yet people recognize it. Though as newer generations come along, they have a particular problem because they're losing that. But you only have to look at Coca-Cola to see the script, Coca-Cola, to recognize it's quintessentially American. And we had to recreate that in Route 66. A lot of people just say, well, all you have to do is put the Route 66 symbol on the product. Well, no, lots of products out there now. And we started in 2000 when we launched the brand. In 2000, from 2000 to 2015, we really created the franchise for Route 66 products. So we ended up with a product that had a net revenue of around 200 million a year.
Euros.
It could have been more, but it's certainly not shabby. When you think that you've created a product that has a value between half to $750 million, and you've literally done it yourself. And we were very conscious of the fact that we had to get this right. Far too many products, as you know, like our corporate, they come out of some corporate grinder. They're down to the lowest common denominator. And they think that this is going to appeal to everybody. And of course, you don't want anything that appeals to everybody. You want something that appeals to a certain community that is going to bring it up, that other people want to be part of. If you make it appeal to everybody, nobody's going to want it. And that's still something that large corporations haven't understood. Well, it took us 18 months, honestly, of introducing elements into maintaining those elements, even to the extent of printing a tax stamp on the top of the pack, because American cigarettes always had this blue tax stamp, and we introduced that element in there. And then I tested the market. We went out and I managed to sell into several duty-free shops, and I stand outside one a week. And I had the enormous satisfaction when I would approach somebody who bought our cigarettes and I'd say, our product, why did you buy that? And the satisfaction of hearing them say, but I always buy this product when I'm in America. The fact that we got it so right, the fact that, by the way, 18 months without much income was stretching our finances to the nth degree. We were in massive overdraft by then and still paying the mortgage. But we were determined to get it right. If you're going to do something, you have to do it right. But the satisfaction of hearing that, hearing somebody say, or people say, oh, but I always buy this product when I'm in America, and it had never been sold there, never been made or sold there.
You manufactured reality, André. You manufactured reality.
We had. Even to this day, sometimes I wonder about it. We'd stuck to our guns. Despite, people say, why don't you modernize it? And we even had one particular executive who said, people don't even know what this tax stamp is. He's scratching at the pack. I didn't want to tell him, when was the last time you had somebody engage with your product in the way that you're engaging with it now?
Explain the scratch. Explain the scratch.
The flash?
Yeah.
You mean the tax stamp?
Yeah, no, the engagement, because we can't show the product.
Well, the engagement was that they were so fascinated by the product, and they saw the tax stamp was actually printed on the pack, and they were scratching it to see if it would come off, because the original tax stamp is applied, you pay the government the duty, and that's applied when the product is manufactured, applied on the production process. So it would come out and you'd have this blue band. Now you could rip the band off if you wanted to, or whatever, but that was the blue tax stamp that was universal across all American cigarettes because it was American government issued and the government printed it and supplied it to you. So it was attached, if you like, to the subconscious awareness of a consumer to an American cigarette. And so we maintained it, we introduced it. We would love to have actually printed it over, but there wasn't much chance that we could actually do that. Not least of which because we could have been accused of counterfeiting tax stamps, which should have been an interesting experience.
Interesting. That's a very British understatement.
Yes, you can say that again.
But
So that's really what it was. It was all about the different elements, putting it together, really. And it took 18 months. It was not easy to do.
Years ago, I had a friend that was like a branding mastermind, gave me this sentence that gets stuck in my head, and it comes up as you're talking. And he said about the definition of what is a brand, and his way of representing a brand is a promise fulfilled. So it's like if I'm an American cigarette brand, then there's a lot of sub promises that I have to fulfill for me to feel that this is an American brand. And you managed to do that, to tick that box.
We did. And, if you ask me what is a brand, I would say brand is truth. If the brand lies to you, then you're not going to buy it.
Yeah.
And it is a promise. It's a promise of not just of, sorry, what did you say? Repeat again. It's a promise
fulfilled. Because, for example, and here's the analogy, right? McDonald's is a restaurant. A Michelin star restaurant is a restaurant. We're both a restaurant, but they have different promises, right? And when I walk into a McDonald's, my expectation is to get my meal quickly, hot, not to die, right? Not to die from food poisoning. That's my expectation. Nothing so much about the taste, maybe the consistency, the expectations, right? When I go to a Michelin restaurant, by the way, there's a lot of food poisoning in Michelin restaurants because they do a lot of experiments and things like that, but it has to be wrapped in a certain way. It might take them 4 hours to give me my, I don't know, engineered fruit soup or whatever, like things like that. But it's a different promise. And I measure them on different scales. And if McDonald's doesn't deliver the promise, even if it's a much better burger, right? Let's say McDonald's delivers an amazing burger, but it takes them 2 hours to deliver it, I will be disappointed, right? And if a Michelin restaurant, if it doesn't give me that, amazing experience or over the top experience, and they give it to me fast, they're not fulfilling their promise in a way.
It's very real, and that's why I say that for me, a brand is truth. It's true to what you believe the brand is going to give you, and as a consequence, the brand has to be true. And you made an interesting point there when you said that you don't expect a Michelin-starred burger from McDonald's, and this is also something that I think that a lot of corporations don't understand. Certainly, if you look in the beer industry, for instance, the explosion of craft beers was predicated on producing the best craft beer you possibly could produce. The only issue with that is you could only drink one of those, really. It wasn't a sessionable product by any means. And also you had to invest. If your USP was this, you created this unique product that can't really be copied or transferred to another product, then you've limited your opportunities. And for instance, in our products, we always put a very good product in, but we don't want to reinvent the wheel. The truth is first of all, the experience that you get from buying our product, the memories it gives you, and if not memories, the visions it gives you of the future, present, or imagination. It awakens your imagination. And the hardest thing is, I think, for a brand is not to tell the consumer what to think, but to allow the consumer the influences that the product generates, allow them to create their own picture. There's much greater satisfaction in that. But secondly, by not inventing the wheel when it comes to the formula. You don't want something that is so fantastic. It's going to be so expensive that most people can't afford to buy it. So you have to find somewhere in the middle, and you have to find very good product, but that is something that people can enjoy, can enjoy, as opposed to buying this just once every 6 months or so. You're not going to buy Yamazaki 25-year-old and put it in a Johnny Walker Red bottle and then try and convince people that they should spend the same money on a Johnny Walker Red bottle as they've done on a Yamazaki 25, which is actually a very good whiskey bottle. We digress slightly.
Let's go back to the brand building of Route 66. So for those who don't understand, like, Route 66 exists, right? It's the biggest road in the United States. It already exists in the consciousness. It's a brand in the sense that there's awareness of it. Like, so did you and your wife start owning it in terms of the tobacco? How did you make it your own?
A, you couldn't trademark it, and B, you could. It had already been trademarked. But we decided anyway we'd do a search. To our amazement, nobody trademarked it. So we made a couple of slight changes to the actual traditional route sign. We introduced a star to suggest a particular year, 1966, and we changed things very slightly. And lo and behold, we succeeded in getting a trademark. Yeah. And if we hadn't done that, other people would have moved in at some point, I'm sure, as other people have done. As you know, I mean, there are lots of products of Route 66 on them, but none of those have the sort of revenue generating ability to the categories that we specifically chose, and nor do they have the depth either of what it is that I'm not boasting here. You know,
it's okay to be proud of a job well done. It's okay.
Well, we have the empirical evidence to back it up,
Yeah.
which is why I'm not boasting. And it's not to say diminish anybody else's work. It's just a different approach that we take to products that other people take. You know, we take a long-term approach to everything we do. We view this having a long-term potential. Otherwise, there's no point in doing it. There's no satisfaction in churning brands up all the time. Now, we could have made a lot of money by churning up brands, cheap brands, for instance, going for the cheaper categories, cheaper sectors. There'll always be somebody who's cheaper. How satisfying is that? Not very.
So I think we're jumping a bit ahead. So you had this, after pushing the envelope financially, putting the envelope in terms of your situation, you had a success. Basically, you created a brand from nothing. Not only that brand was perceived by customers to have already existed before it actually came to the market. You got your revenue to 200 million euros, not too shabby. So, okay, so explain what happened. Yeah.
You know, the interesting thing about corporates is that we were very fortunate in our timing and when we did this, really. The corporates that I had worked for were very, how to say it, there was very much a social strata in the companies. For instance, one of the first company I worked in Barry, because I said, if a director stepped into the lift, you had to step out. It was that sort of environment. There was no incitement and incentive to think outside the box, or, you know, that was your role. This is what you did, and you did it. So when we moved forward with Route 66, we were very fortunate indeed to come across chief executive who had come out of the Hansen's table, and Peel Tobacco was actually owned by Hansen, and just as the directors, all ex-Hansen directors. And Hansen gave an awful lot of responsibility to his within very tight financial constraints. So the real boss was actually the financial director. But other than that, they had a lot of freedom. Now, we had approached the previous managing director of the international division, who was very dismissive, part of the old school, and said, we'll see what you do with it, shall we? And basically laughed us out of the office. 2 years later, it's always worth reapproaching people. And I did, and it just so happened that this man was on sick leave because of bad back, and a gentleman called Gareth Davis had been parachuted in to manage the international division. He took one look at the blank that I sent him. I said, we're looking for contract manufacturer within the UK for the UK market. And he was on the telephone. Next day, I had a meeting with him in Bath. And at the same meeting, we basically did a deal for a 20-year licensing program. And he'd understood it immediately. He didn't need an explanation. He really didn't. So that was we were very fortunate, because with other companies, we would have struggled to have got that across immediately. Now, it wasn't plain sailing, by the way, because he was one man. As he himself describes it, as a not invented here syndrome was a very strong syndrome running through the company. He had the vision, he had the means to make it work. It took us another 18 months, 2 years actually, to negotiate the contract ultimately. because this was not something they were used to, an individual walking in. They were used to buying large corporations.
Yeah.
They didn't know how to handle an individual. An entrepreneur who walked in, negotiated on his own, would sit in front of 7 or 8 ex-Hanson directors and negotiate the agreement on their own. So I was very much an unknown quantity. I walked in with a team of lawyers and a team of directors. They would have been on much firmer ground, but I didn't, and I wasn't.
And then what?
Well, then we licensed it. Then we worked with them for a while. It was clear that corporate culture and the entrepreneurial culture, the chief executive isn't going to step in and make these decisions at this stage. You then get into the process-driven and the ego-driven world of corporate world, and entrepreneurs and the corporate world frequently butt heads. And so we did butt head. But one thing we do understand about large corporates. They're not very good at innovating themselves, and they need innovators. They need entrepreneurs. They just don't know how to handle them. They really don't. So it took a while, but in the end, we came up with a compromise solution. They wanted control. They offered a de minimis amount of money to go away, and we're taking the brand back. And they sat down. We had a serious negotiation, but this time was between me and the chief executive. And actually, my lawyer was in the room at that time. His lawyer wasn't even there, though he did have the in-house lawyer there. And within a short period of time, again, because we have mutual respect for each other, and I have enormous respect for Gareth Davis, I really do. He showed respect, he showed integrity throughout the entire process. And we did a deal that satisfied both parties. So we sold out at a significant upfront payment instead of the multiplier that they would have had to have paid at the end of the contract, but we retained the royalty income. So it actually worked extremely well.
Amazing.
For both parties. But that's because both parties were prepared to negotiate.
Yeah.
The problem is, if you have a chief executive who is either stupid or so ego-driven that they believe that you should do what they tell you to do, then you're not going to come to any sort of agreement. But with Gareth, he was willing to listen to reason. He had his own internal corporate challenges that he had to meet. As long as he was able to meet those and we were able to come to mutual understanding, the deal was done. It was always capable and possible to do a deal with two individuals. Rarely is it possible when the corporate culture is such that it militates against that.
And so you had your, I would say, first big success, right? Like even very big success after a lot of trials and tribulations. So like, how did that kind of take you to other products and other development? You're laughing.
Well, I laugh because I blame my wife.
Does she know that? I mean, this is being recorded. I have to warn you. It's being recorded.
No. I have told my wife this before. Yes, we retired. We'd been 12 and a half years without a holiday. 7.5 years of those on £60 a week, more or less, as a budget. This was, it's a huge struggle. Really was. So we decided together that it would be nice if we just retired. Rather young to retire, but then realized it then. And so we did. We retired. I went and played golf. And I think it was after being on the same golf course for about the third or fourth time in the same week that I rang her up and I said, look, this retirement isn't doing me any good at all. If I continue like this, you're going to find me hanging from the next
Did your golf game at least get better? Did you get better?
I'm sorry?
Did you get better at golf? Did you at least get better at golf?
I improved at my golf, but the idea of my playing golf for the rest of my life and, not stretching further than that didn't do anything for me. No, I actually improved very well. I enjoyed playing golf, but, there had to be other things in life. Yes. Golf is a reward in many respects. If it becomes something you do out of habit, and, I could see a lot of people in the golf club that meet up every day. There'd be a group of retirees or even younger people that meet up. They always have similar conversations. They'd replay the golf match to the nth degree in the bar. And I just enjoyed the golf match. Yeah. I didn't need to replay. If I had used a different club on this, I might have had a different. No, it was too late. I'd already done it. Enjoyed the experience. I'm not going to sit there and do a forensic on that. So I thought, well, what can we do? And I thought, well, let's do spirits this time. I thought, I'm not going to do a Scotch whiskey. And I was looking around and I thought, Irish whiskey is really very badly promoted at the time. The time was Jameson and their promotion.
What year are we talking about?
So we're talking about 2001, 2001. So my retirement didn't last very long. I remember Mairead's observation was, you could have made a better fist of trying to retire.
You could have made an effort,
So,
André.
I could have made a better effort, yes,
Yeah.
but no, I had too much energy and too much curiosity. I walked into the same thing in spirits. So, as I said, Jameson was the market leader, still is, and at the time, Irish whiskey was being marketed as a product you put into Irish coffee. So there was no pride in the product. Irish whiskey put into Irish coffee. So what do people know about Irish whiskey, which used to be the dominant whiskey? Irish whiskey was sold at around the turn of the last century than Scotch whiskey. But for various reasons, which, by the way, the Irish Whiskey Association and the Irish government keep on maintaining, and they keep on getting it wrong. They keep saying these are the reasons why, and the main reason they claim is the invention of the coffee still. And the coffee still was invented by an Irishman, which is essentially a continuous still, whereas Irish whiskey traditionally was made in pot stills, which meant that you had it was one process that you had to clean out the pot still before you created the next process. And the coffee still was a vertical still. It's used to, now it's used to make vodka, grain whiskey. And they keep saying that it wasn't adopted by Ireland. Ireland had more coffee stills than Scotland had. But the real reason that Irish whiskey actually failed, and again, this is never spoken of, is that when the British government, after the War of Independence and its particular period of time, Ireland fell under, to a certain extent, UK law, and the UK had minimum maturation periods for Scotch whisky. The UK government had actually identified Scotch whisky as being a product of enormous economic potential and had encouraged it. So the minimum in Scotland was 3 years. All of a sudden, however, they introduced a 5-year minimum maturation period in Ireland, in a country that historically did not have a minimum maturation period. So you suddenly had companies with a whole lot of product that they couldn't sell. And both the reason that the government give, which is completely wrong, is the fact that the Irish didn't take up the coffee still, and the fact there was a religious movement against drinking, which is quite true. But Ireland spirit was the most exported spirit. So the fact that the Irish themselves stopped drinking wouldn't have made a huge difference. If they actually had whiskey they could legally call whiskey. After a few years, the 5-year period was reduced to 3 years. You won't find a mention of that 5-year period, or the fact that actually Ireland bought more coffee stills. I think they had 12 to Scotland's 4, and you won't find that mentioned either. You'll always find a reason why Irish whiskey didn't work. It was always somebody else's. So that's the real story. And reading at that, I thought this is a wonderful opportunity, and I didn't know what were you going to call it? So I asked my creative director again, and she said the Wild Geese, and I said, who are they? What are they? And that's when she told me the story of the Wild Geese, the story of the Irish diaspora. And I have to tell you, by the way, that one of the main criteria in our products is that they had to tell a story. Whether that story was subconscious or conscious, it had to tell a story. It had to communicate with the consumer. The consumer had to get something out of that. It had to be an interaction between the consumer and the product. And the best way to do that is to have a story to tell that the consumer can relate to in their own way.
So what's the story of the
And
Wild
so the
Geese?
story,
Yeah, please.
the story of the Wild Geese, the story of the Irish diaspora, which started in 1691 when the Irish lost the final War of Independence. And they signed a treaty in 1691, which basically said that if they wished to live in Ireland, they would have to give up arms and they would have to swear fealty to the crown, or they could go into exile and take their arms with them and they could fight overseas. Well, the vast majority decided to actually take the latter option, and they left. And they large numbers went into France, Spain, and after a while, the name of the Wild Geese became attached to anybody who left Ireland. They took the name Wild Geese originally. There are many stories around that, but the main one really was because geese always return to their place of birth. So there was this determination that they would regain control and ownership of their country, of their culture. And it's a story which spans every single continent and every country in the world. And a lot of Irish didn't appreciate it because history is always taught by the victor, as you know. So Irish history really ended in 1691, but eight of the signatures to the American Declaration of Independence, for instance, were of Irish descent. They were Wild Geese. We sent a team across to the Alamo, film crew across to the Alamo for St. Patrick's Day. The first flag that you see flying in the Alamo is the Irish tricolour. And that's because a significant proportion of the defenders of the Alamo were actually of immediate Irish descent.
Interesting.
Including the main characters. Bernardo O'Higgins, an original Wild Geese, was the liberator of Central and South America. And, the story goes on. The influence that they had was enormous. In the French wine industry, for instance, they had enormous influence. So you have Lynch Barge, Cohen, Phelan, they're all very famous wines from that particular region. Hennessy cognac. Hennessy is the Earl of Hennessy, one of the original Wild Geese, who left and who created Hennessy cognac. And to this day, the family still has an Irish blood. But the story of the Wild Geese is embedded in the history of practically every continent and every country. And there's a resonance to them. In America in particular, where you have the largest ex-Irish, Irish-American community, the largest Wild Geese community, very proudly call themselves Irish-American, as in fact the Americans do. They call themselves French-American or German-American, but there was always their origin first. And this was a huge market, a huge opportunity. And we wanted to talk about the pride of Ireland. And, when Maid explained to me just how badly the Irish present themselves. And honestly, when I thought of Ireland, even though I was married to somebody who was Irish, you couldn't get away from the sort of the Paddy Day and Patrick's Day celebration. They turned the rivers green, they wore silly hats, they got drunk and they danced a jig. And when you ask people about what do they think of the Irish, very often, Guinness, Paddy's Day, a silly hat, these things that came up. And what I wanted to do and what I wanted to do, because that resonated so strongly with me from my background, as you can imagine. In one sense, we came from similar backgrounds, but from different cultures. The state and the contribution that each diaspora has made in its own way. And I thought this is a wonderful story. It really is. What a wonderful story to be able to tell. And so we wanted to raise the image of the Irish, at the same time produce a product that they could be proud of. And that's what we did. We started with the Wild Geese. But we immediately butted heads with Irish distillers who saw the competition that the Wild Geese could have. I mean, Irish distillers had particular problems with Jameson, which they still have, not least of which because Jameson is actually named after Scottish distiller. So it's hardly the sort of thing that you really want to add to your Irish whiskey product, would you? So you've called it after Scottish distiller, whereas here you have the Wild Geese, which is the story of the Irish diaspora, which is the story, in fact, of everybody's Irish background. So it didn't matter who you were part of that story. You were part of the story of the Irish diaspora. And so you could communicate. It wasn't just that, but for many other diasporas as well. There's a sort of resonance there, and it became another love project to do. And again, a product that we had to get right.
And you kept on doing this again and again, right? Like, so how many brands did you kind of develop from scratch, kind of capture the story into a bottle, if we would say?
Well, with the Wild Geese, it was obviously Irish whiskey. We also went into other Irish variants like gin, vodka, honey liquor, but we also have different Irish whiskey brands, all of which have a story, all of which have a meaning. They're not just an Irish name tacked onto a bottle and people expected to know what it actually means. If you can't describe it on the bottle, and one of our favorite products is the Dullahan. And the Dullahan is an Irish spirit, quite deliberately immature whiskey. It's actually, I suppose you would legally call it Pachin, but we call it an Irish spirit because nobody understands what Pachin is, but it's an immature whiskey. But we play with the story of the Dullahan on the product and on the label. So we actually have a lot of fun with our products as well. We want the consumer to have fun, to read that, to laugh and to think, I could enjoy this. So that's a large part of what we do. We still have Route 66 now in beer, Olo. We have other products, Metal Guru, which speaks for itself, which is a product specifically designed for high-end metal consumer products. We have Instant Karma, again, which speaks for itself. We have a very, very sort of aware skull-wearing cool sunglasses. So that really stands out on the shelf and, speaks to a certain community. So we have several brands that we've developed that we've had great fun in developing. Also met huge challenges from large corporations who don't want a competitor They don't want to see a competitor. They want to own the category. In their eyes, this category belongs to them. Again, my view is there's room for, we'll come back to that aspect of competition. Large number of products are out there. And, if you look at Irish whiskey, you've got a lot of Irish whiskies out there, but they're not really selling. First of all, because the main brand dominates, or the main brands dominate. So you have 4 brands, which have dominated for the last 40 years almost, same brands. And you have other brands. Now, these other brands don't have a story, but they're there, they're out there on the shelf, but they gather dust. But they're Irish whiskies. And so, if that is the situation, and you have a downturn, alleged downturn in Irish whiskey at the moment, you don't really. What you have is the consumer rebelling against the fact that the only products they're offered for sale are Jameson or Tullamore or Bushmills. Why should we buy them? We don't see the other products. We can't try them. We can't taste them. We can't see them visibly. Why should we continue to buy the same thing that either our parents bought or our grandparents bought, or we're forced to buy because that's all there is? So that's really the issue.
I mean, you talk about it and I see the disappointment in your face.
I'm sorry?
I see the dissatisfaction in your face as you speak about that.
Yes, I do, because large corporates have manipulated the environment to gain control. The real issue for me is that entrepreneurs are have to fight that much harder to succeed. Now, look, we old enough and ugly enough, as you know, certainly where I'm concerned.
I think we're beautiful inside, at least, man. At least inside. At least inside.
Look, everybody's going to think that I paid you thousands to make this. If you keep saying these things.
Oh, it's like I'm including myself. It's a mutually inclusive compliment.
Exactly.
Right? We are beautiful inside.
We are beautiful inside, really. And we have a vision. We have something that is worth offering. But we don't all have the ability, for instance, to do a deal with the government whereby, for instance, we can transfer 2.8 billion euros, as Pernod Ricard did, from its operation in Ireland, and pay 0.67% tax. We don't have that. Whilst I respect Trump's attitude when it comes to tariff barriers, I don't think that the tariff barriers are going to make the slightest difference, because the large corporations are just going to do deals with their governments whereby the tariff is somehow going to disappear in the tax that they end up, or the deal that they end up by paying. But the entrepreneur is going to be stuck with the full.
Small, medium.
They're all going to face. And, I wrote a piece on LinkedIn where I argued strongly for President Trump to exempt SMEs, which are companies up to £50 million or euro turnover, dollar turnover, from the tariffs, because that would make the difference. The problem is that 95%, 97% of all companies are SMEs. The large corporations take up a very small footprint in terms of the number of corporations. And all the large corporations are going to do are going to make a lot of people redundant. Those people are going to have 2 choices. They either go on Social Security or they form a company. So you're going to have all these people forming companies that aren't going to go anywhere. So instead, if you changed your approach and you said that these tariffs will only apply to large corporations and that SMEs will be exempt from the tariffs, you would reinvigorate competition. You would nullify the effect of the deals that the corporates will make with the governments, and you'll re-engage with your economic community. And, if President Trump has started by doing that, for instance, saying in America that he's going to, by stating that, we will exempt small corporations from that, would have made it very difficult for the communities outside of the US to say, well, we're not going to do the same thing to US corporations. But here was a lost opportunity to change the economic face, or the face of economic activity around the world. It really was. I'm excluding China in this respect, by the way, because most Chinese companies are SMEs. Or they produce 90% of what we all buy. But nonetheless, within Europe, within most of the developing countries, by excluding the SMEs and the tariffs, you would have reinvigorated it. And any country that said we're not going to do the same thing, we're not going to reciprocate, would have to answer to the electorate. So it wouldn't have changed the objective that he had, but I think it would really, really give a boost to the entrepreneurial category, the SME, which is really suffering, because they're suffering the full impact. Large corporations are suffering a partial impact of the tariffs, but it's not really going to make a difference to them because of the backroom deals that they're going to make with the governments that would be more than willing to make, because that's how they've operated the last 25 years. So yeah,
So-
there's a sense of disappointment.
So, because I don't think anybody is reading our policy statements at the moment, but hopefully there's a bunch of entrepreneurs that are going to listen to this and kind of, in terms of like, what would you say, like, what I don't know, kernel of wisdom, based on your experience, would you say to entrepreneurs that want to go and to create things from nothing and compete with large corporations?
Well, I mean, you told me this wonderful story of one of your friends who's done this 6 times. He's spotted a gap. His company's been bought by the company that he spotted the gap in. He left, he formed another company having identified another gap.
Yeah.
So we succeeded because we identified gaps that existed because large corporates didn't understand the environment that they were operating in. And I mean that with the greatest of respect to large corporates, because they are very, very clever and intelligent people running these large corporates, but they become too process-driven. They become too distant from the community, from themselves. They don't see themselves. If only they could see themselves as a consumer and walk in the footsteps of the consumer, ordinary consumer, rather than this elevated position that they have of themselves, they may change their approach to entrepreneurs. If only they lost their jobs and were forced to go out and work for themselves. In fact, for a lot of them, that may well happen if this continues. Only then will they really appreciate the contribution that entrepreneurs have. So the key take is identify the gap and then believe in it and then work to get it right. Quick fixes don't work. They really don't. You stick a sticking plaster onto a shelf and stick it up and hope that it's going to last. And it doesn't. It comes crashing down behind you. You need to cement it in properly. And that takes perseverance, that takes guts, takes the willingness to make a lot of mistakes. Because I have made a lot more mistakes than I have made correct decisions, really. So 2 things. Be willing to, first of all, identify a gap and be willing to make mistakes. I mean, I admire Elon Musk. Get it wrong quickly. He has the financial resources to do that. But in many respects, we can all do that. Get it wrong quickly. If you're going to do that, get it wrong, get it out of the way, learn from what you've done. Don't take forever. Don't research something to the lowest common denominator. Do the opposite. Go for the highest common denominator and bring everybody up with you. That's 3 things. You wanted 1, but you can pick
I
and
didn't want
choose.
one. It's as many as you want. It's like as many as you want. Amazing.
So that's really the principle that we were. And it's not easy.
No. If it was easy, everybody would do it, right? And there's a reason not everybody does it, because it's not easy. It's not. Look, you at least have your hair after all these years. At least you come back to this.
Yeah. Well,
I
don't know where that came from. I'm just fortunate that my father was bald by the time he was 50.
take it.
Am I complaining? Do you see me complaining?
No. I think this is something that I come back to again and again. It's attributed to Churchill that the secret of success is to go from failure to failure with unequivocal enthusiasm.
Yes. Absolutely. You have to believe in yourself. You really do. You have to believe. You have to believe in the vision.
Yeah.
As long as you keep learning from your failures.
Yes.
Because a failure is not a failure. It's a learning process. It's no longer a failure. Damn, what I did didn't get me to what I wanted. So what do I have to change to get me where I need to be?
Yeah. Next. Amazing. I think this is a great place to stop. André, thank you very much.
Thank you, Haggai.
It's a wrap. This Haggai's podcast episode ends here, but you don't. Now, is it crazy to think that you know somebody who'd love this episode? Share it with them, and they'll love you for it.